Welcome everyone, I'm Matthew, a psychology student, and this is MangaPsyche, where we navigate through the mind of manga characters. Today, we're diving into Homunculus and how you lie to yourself, the lack of identity, a child in a reckless robot body, essential emptiness, and the deep desire to return to the womb. That is the subject of this psychological analysis, and I invite you to explore how deep the rabbit hole goes. Homunculus is a seinen manga, written and illustrated by Hideo Yamamoto. It was serialized in weekly big comic spirits from 2003 to 2011, and collected in 15 volumes published by Jacques. The story takes place in the early 2000s and follows Susumu Nakoshi, a former actuary for a bank in the life insurance sector. In short, his job consisted of assigning value to people's lives. A striking episode in his career occurring to a date when he tells his partner how he killed a billionaire company, allowing his own company to obtain large profits for the cost of the unemployment of all the company's employees. His partner then asks him if he doesn't feel guilty about it, and Nakoshi replies that as long as he doesn't see the consequences of his actions, it's fine. A clever detail of the manga is that the author from the beginning shows the protagonist as some morally grey, a dubious character, and above all, a compulsive liar according to the homeless people. We're not following the classic hero's journey, but rather that of a man who was shaped by society to be who he is. Here's a critique from the author of how much we're led to desire and be what people want us to be. Keep this information, I will elaborate on this later. One fateful day, he takes a taxi in a clandestine town. During the conversation, he discovered that the taxi driver had been an employee of one of the companies he helped destroy. The man says that after losing his job, he has lost his wife and contact with his son. In short, he lost everything and started living in a rented place in an isolated area. Nakoshi is deeply disturbed, and what he had repressed in his unconscious returned with force. He started to sweat a lot, and when paying the fare, tells the driver to keep the change, an ego defense mechanism known as compensation, was to deal with the guilt for the harm he caused. With his conscience devasted, Nakoshi takes an extended vacation from his job and starts living inside an old car, parked between the luxury hostel he used to frequent with his partners in a square inhabited by homeless people. However, he still maintains his dark suit and his dress shirt, and begins to behave like a wanderer between two worlds. When unpacking the unconscious conflict that led Nakoshi to this situation, we find out Sigmund Freud and later Anna Freud formulated about the theory of ego defense mechanism, phenomena that our psyche uses to avoid suffering. In Nakoshi's case, there is compensation and undoing, which manifests, for example, when he offers gifts to the woman after hooking up with them, or when he gives a 10,000 yen note to the taxi driver for a fare that costs almost 8,000 yen, within the change. Compensation is a mechanism for dealing with guilt, humiliation, or shame, and serve to affirm kindness and control. Undoing, according to Anna Freud, is, as the name suggests, the act of undoing an action perceived as a transgression. Another defense mechanism present is rationalization, which consists of the cognitive reframing of unethical actions. For example, I will steal to give to the poor. In Nakoshi's case, this is expressed by turning his work into a game and others' suffering into numbers, in addition to denying the reality, like a soldier who, when carry out a cruel command, says, "I'm just following orders." Here, Hideo Yamamoto returned to the character essence, lying not only to others, but also to himself. The setting in which Nakoshi lives is a representation of the psychic structure. The hotel represents the ID, where Nakoshi's deep desires are told in real life. The baker's bar symbolizes the superego, a space where he punishes himself for having destroyed the lives of so many people and seeks to repair for his mistakes by having those homeless. Between the two is the ego, responsible for mediating the conflict forces. It is important to highlight that both the ID and superego are fundamental to the existence of human beings. It must be said that this manga is an amusement park for fans of psychoanalysis. Well, after these events, Nakoshi, as mentioned, started living in the car, but he developed an almost symbiotic relationship with it. He likes to feel the car with his own body, rubbing his face on the steering wheel and caressing as one caresses a woman to find out what's wrong with it, in addition to sleep in a fetal position. No, he doesn't sleep like that because there's a little space. This is not so secret. The car, for some reason, reminds him of his mother's womb. Nakoshi's desire is a death drive, not necessarily suicidal, but as Freud was postulated in his book Beyond the Pleasure Principle, is an innate desire to return to an inanimate state, and the womb is the closest we know to that. Just as man was expelled from Eden, the baby is expelled from the mother's body. Life in the womb is a paradise lost, where we're protected, warmed, fed, and didn't have to deal with the anguish and anxiety of our choices and their consequences. Our protagonist is tormented by the past, and his car with his heater on simulates exactly that lost world. Then one day, an eccentric rich, wealthy 22-year-old medical student with bleached hair, fake tattoos, and facial piercings named Manabu Ito knocks on the car door and makes a strange proposal. As someone curious about human beings, he discovered a procedure called repanation, which, according to studies and research of dubious quality, by making a 20 centimeters hole in the skull without affecting the meninges, will relieve pressure on the brain, making the blood circulate better, sharpening the 5 senses, and even activating a 6th. The explanation is that in childhood, the brain is free of pressure, and the more one grows, the firmer it gets. Why this is good for protecting us, it seems to limit our brain capacity, which is why trepanation is performed. Would be a return to the child's brain with the potential of an adult. Nakoshi at first denied this absurd proposal to make a small hole on his head, and Manabu leaves. However, when Nakoshi talks to the homeless people about how to get a job, they tell him they sell their organs and identities to stay alive. The catalyzing event for him to accept his venture is that the government is going to tow his car, and he doesn't have the money to get it back, so he sees himself forced to accept Manabu's proposal. The point here is that Manabu has studied almost everything about human beings, from medicine to psychology to exotericism, and wants to prove himself that supernatural does not exist, partly because he's fearful despite his bad boy appearance, and partly of a mere curiosity. There are reports of patients who underwent trepanation who supposedly obtain supernatural powers like telepathy, precognition, and seeing ghosts, and our young doctor intends to demystify this. The surgery is simple and without complications. After the procedure, Manabu established that the experiment will last 10 days, during which time Nakoshi will be subjected to various tests to ascertain superhuman abilities. They do card guessing tests, visit haunted places where murder happened but nothing relevant occurred. They have dinner and say goodbye. Alone and walking through the streets, Nakoshi is hit by the gust of death and wind that makes him fall to the ground, and he closes his left eye. At this moment, with only his right eye open, he starts seeing deformed human beings. A chubby man passing by is now a thin as paper, like a cartoon character crushed by a truck. A tree woman, a man with his body split in the middle, a woman with an inverted body, all kind of grotesque and disturbing things, until he bumps into Yakuza, who is seen as a Megazord robot, with a child inside with some problem with his pinky finger. When Nakoshi says this to the Yakuza, he begins to cry involuntarily and leaves the scene. The following day, Nakoshi calls Manabu and they meet at the hotel. There, it's explained that Nakoshi now has power to see homunculus, which are the manifestation of traumas and representations from the unconscious, or as the manga likes to call it, the power to see people's hearts. A power Freud would love to have. Actually, they only have this conversation after the Yakuza part, but when I was writing the script, I got ahead of myself. So let's get back to the video. Here begins the Yakuza like a robot arc. Intrigued by this new power, Nakoshi returns to the place where he met the Yakuza and is taken by the henchmen to the Tojo clan. I mean, to the mobster officer. There, he meets the Yakuza boss, and neither of them really knows what they're doing there, only that something unites them. The Nakoshi begins his investigation in a rather invasive and very strange way. Remember when I said Nakoshi had to fill the car with his own body to know what the problem was? Well, here he also needs to fill another man's body. Obviously, the Yakuza doesn't like this and punches Nakoshi in the face. Nakoshi, by revealing details of the past and similarities, makes the gangster feel threatening at first, but gradually he lowers his guard and identifies with Nakoshi. Let me explain what happened here. In psychoanalysis, transference refers to unconscious redirection of feelings, desires, and expectations from important figures in one's early life, usually parents or caregiver, onto analysts, or more broadly, to new peoples in one's life. Freud first observed it around 1895 to 1905, when he noticed patients developing strong emotional attachments, hostility, or idealization towards him. He realized these reactions weren't really about him, but about unresolved feelings from childhood relationships being transferred onto him. Rather than being an obstacle, Freud discovered that transference is the royal road to insight. The patient relieves emotional conflicts with the analyst. Analyst interprets these feelings as repetitions of past experience, and through insights, the patient can finally recognize and work through them consciously instead of repeating them in life. A process called working through the transference. Freud also noted that analysts have emotional reactions to patients too. Their own unresolved material gets stirred up out of Nakoshi interactions with the homunculus revolve around this concept. Just like the Yakuza, Nakoshi also harmed a friend when he was a child. Nakoshi and his friend Ken were skateboarding when he pushed Ken lightly, as a joke, but he was hit by a truck that handed over his friend's leg. He's never walked correctly again and had his life ruined. Nakoshi, consumed by enormous guilt, repressed this in his unconscious and never spoke again to his friend. In the Yakuza's case, he had a friend named Kazuo, and when they were children, they both worked on a plantation, cutting sugarcane with a saito. By accident, the Yakuza cut off his friend's pink finger and was frightened by the amount of blood and the act itself, and repressed it in his unconscious. Again, the psychoanalysis explains this as repetition compulsion. What remains in the unconscious never stays there forever. Instead, it manifests in various ways, repetition being one of them. In the situation, the man unconsciously became a Yakuza to deal with the trauma of having cut off the pinky, an attempt to overcome the past, and a fulfillment that never comes. The resolution occurs when Nakoshi and the Yakuza acknowledge what they did. There is this catharsis and they finally forgive themselves for what happened. In a final act of reparation, the Yakuza cut off his own pinky finger with Nakoshi's help, finally confronting the trauma definitively and ceased to be a criminal. Notice how returning to the beginning of life is a recurring term in this story. This is because, according to psychoanalysis, our entire personality, our constitutional being, is forged in childhood. Our relationship with our parents, other people, and their environment serve as a pattern of how we will behave in the future, which is why in psychoanalytic therapy there's an emphasis on searching the past to resolve the present. In the following chapter, Manabu takes Nakoshi to a Namasera to look for a new generation teenage homunculus. It's explained that Namasera were establishment in early 21st century Japan, where high school girls wearing their uniform and hidden behind one-way glass would sell their used clothing to customers. There, they meet number 1705, a 17-year-old girl who sparks a strong attraction in Manabu and makes Nakoshi somewhat uncomfortable, mainly because she's a sentient homunculus that can take any form, even the most grotesque. Notice how none of them have a name, which for obvious reasons is to preserve anonymity. But the semiotics of this presentation also serve to demonstrate how, in the eyes of Japanese society, they are seen as a product. This is something Nakoshi will also question. It's no wonder that number 1775 never reveals her name during the meeting with them. She's just a statistic in the eyes of others, the representation of female Japanese rebellion. In Manabu's words, she's the true symbol of the modern world, a world that doesn't care about your authenticity, about your identity, only that you fit the mold they provide for you. This is why the girl is made of sand, constantly changing form to please others. Manabu's question of the girl aligns with the discourse of how society, especially her parents, must follow a pattern of rules to exist. There is a need to label, to put every behavior in a small box. If the 1775 rebellion is already part of the script, as he says, if no adolescent had rebelled before, it would be impossible for her. Manabu then starts to question who she really is without the labels, without the aid, without a job or education, without a name, or rather who we really are deep down. The girl replied that she is she, and this is the correct answer. However, Manabu realized that she doesn't really know who she is and that she fears her real identity. For Freud, who we really are at heart is not the rational moral being we like to imagine, but a bundle of unconscious wishes and conflicts, primarily sexual and aggressive in nature, which the ego and superego try to control or disguise. In other words, our conscious identity is just the surface, while our true motives, fears, and desire operate below awareness. For Freud, the greatest fears are internal, not external. We fear the very context of our own unconscious, the impulses, desires, and guilt that threaten our moral self-image. Freud summarized this conflict beautifully in Civilization and Discontents. Man is not a gentle creature, is on the contrary, a creature among whose instinctual endowments is to be reckoned a powerful share of aggressiveness. We fear that through that within us lives the potential for both creation and destruction. I must explain that sexual and psychoanalysis does not necessarily mean only sexual intercourse. It can also refer to eros, in Greek, meaning carnal love, passion, or desire, the primal psychic energy that drives us to live. Throughout the interaction with the girl, Manabu reveals himself as a manipulative person, like a predator hunting prey. It's no wonder he suggests that to break the patterns and find her true identity, she needs to have sex with him. The ironic twist is that when they are at the karaoke and Manabu starts to flirt her, the situation reverses. Now she takes control of the situation and starts to provoke Manabu, saying he doesn't smell like a man, makes him put on lipstick, and when they are about to kiss, Manabu puts her hand on her face and says he'll be back. She provokes by calling him a virgin and he runs off in desperation. In Nakoshi's vision, Manabu homunculus is made entirely of water. Commonly, water is sand weakness, but that doesn't happen here, because here is the sand that was swallowing the water. Anyway, the young girl collects on the floor. Nakoshi takes her home. She tries to make her small talk, but he doesn't want to talk to. It's at this moment he discovers that she's actually made of symbols. And not only that, but her mother is a homunculus with a kind of set of needles on her back. She looks like the monster from Elden Ring, which destroys and builds the daughter's image. A clear allusion to how children are often forced to be an idealized object for their parents. The twist in this story is when Nakoshi discovers that she's actually made of small symbols that, when looked up close, form the message. This is relevant to the narrative because, as you can see, the homunculus have something in common that links them to Nakoshi, with 1775 is the symbols. As mentioned earlier, Nakoshi worked at a bank and dealt with numbers. And what numbers if not symbols? And he gets lost in this ocean of symbols. A practical example these days are views, comments, likes, followers, and even money. They are reinforcing symbols that condition us on all we should wear, buy, act, or who to be, what to post. Symbols rob us of our authenticity. However, symbols make up who we are. We cannot exist without them. What the manga suggests is a reinterpretation of those symbols, appropriating them to create its own meaning on the path to authenticity. The psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan represents Freud in the light of structural linguistics and asserts that unconscious is structured like a language. The subject is not an antonymous I, but an effect of the signifiers that inscribes it. Name, gender, family, position, and labels constitute the symbolic existence. Lacan distinguishes three registers: the real, the imaginary, and symbolic, and locates the inscription of the word in the symbolic. When named, the baby leaves the raw real and enters the order of meaning. The phrase, the subject is represented by signifier for not signifier, sums up the subject existence occurs only in the linguistic chain. In contemporary society, the discourse of Joseon predominates, centering language, displacing inscription toward the imaginary, and obscuring the subject of desire. When symbolic fails, the body speaks through symptoms such as self-harm or compulsions. The current challenge is to restore the space of authentic speech in which subject can describe itself as a speaking, desiring being, not merely as image or a dayton. Alone and driving down the street, Nakoshi starts to reflect on how his life was also taken over by symbols. Then, he finds the cell phone that girl 1775 left in the car. He reads the message about her desire to find a boyfriend and become one with him, and right after, she calls the phone and asks him to return it. From here on, things start to get weird, and there's a fine line between right and wrong. I won't comment much, but something very morally dubious and not advisable. But somehow, it works and everything ends up fine, and the girl finds her own identity. There is a line from Nakoshi that emphasizes how Japanese women use sex as a weapon, as means of survival, and how the idea of happy, idealized romance simply doesn't exist. We see how the authors portray the distorted reality of that era, one that, unfortunately, still leaves traces today. The point here is not to blame the woman, but to highlight how much society imposes behavior on her, how women are still seen as object of sexual gratification to be desired and used. It's no coincidence that in the public eye, she must be always pretty, well-behaved, and well-groomed. Those who hold power still want to control woman's body. Skipping this part, the point of discussion I want to bring up, and that the manga continues to discuss in later chapters, is how much authenticity there is in Nakoshi and the others, because don't forget that he's a compulsive liar, and his life entire up to the termination was in a way a lie. Looking through the philosophy of Soren Kierkegaard, Nakoshi lives his entire life in the aesthetic stage. His father called him ugly when he was a child, and added to the fact that he was never a desirable figure, this traumatized him, to the point where he underwent plastic surgery to change his face. He started going to gym, started to get into college, and then to get an excellent job. Ultimately, he reached Japan's upper class and fulfilled every man's dream: an incredible car with a Porsche, a comfortable apartment, lots of money, and any woman he wanted whenever he wanted them. But this wasn't enough to satisfy him, and everyone looked only at his possessions, his symbols, and never the Nakoshi the person. For Kierkegaard, this isn't just about art or luxury, it's an attitude toward existence. An aesthetic person lives for experience, not for truth or purpose. The aesthete is not the one who enjoys most, but the one who constantly avoids despair by losing himself in the moment. Despite its seductiveness, the aesthetic life collapses into boredom and despair. Beneath them lies despair, the quiet sense of being unreal, of lacking selfhood. The unhappy person is the one who has ideal but not himself. The aesthete tries to escape boredom through constantly novelty, travel, parties, romance, through irony or detachment, mocking seriousness, and through cynicism, believing nothing really matters. Yet the escape fails. Beneath them lies despair, the quiet sense of being unreal, of lacking selfhood. Upon falling into despair, Nakoshi begins to try to live an ethical life. That is, the ethical person assumes responsibility for the action and identity. He seeks continue in the currents in life. His duty as expression of freedom and chose to commit something stable to become an individual. Therefore, Homunculus can be said to be a failed and anticlimactic journey, because Nakoshi fails. He fails to reach the religious stage of life. Kierkegaard views the religious life as a high state in which the individual establishes a personal and paradoxical relationship with the infinite and with God. Faith is not a rational ethical conformity, but an existential leap of surrender and trust that cannot be publicly justified. Accepts uncertainty and the absurd and lives in contradiction by choosing to trust despite the lack of certainty. Is the leap of faith. Not only does Nakoshi fail in this, but according to the thought of Jean-Paul Sartre, he lived in bad faith, or mauvaise foi in the original, because even at the end of his journey, he continued to lie to himself to avoid freedom, a lie that transformed into an obsession with homunculus. There is a curious paradox, because as much as the homunculus are the hidden truth of other people, the manga raises the question of whether Nakoshi, when confronting one, is not just confronting and talking to himself. Therefore, he becomes addicted to an abstract truth in this eternal struggle with himself. It's no coincidence that the last homunculus he encounters is himself, and he is condescending towards it. He's trapped in the contradiction that Sartre identifies. He flees from freedom while desiring it. Nakoshi keeps living according to others' expectation. The story of his past success is really a collective notion of success, whereas the life he leads as a homunculus was showed him by Manabu. Is not incapable of the side of himself. Others simply pointed the way, and he lied to himself it was the only option. I'm not arguing that choices must be untouched by influence or that we should renounce humanity and return to the forest. Rather, choices should emerge from a genuine rational or intuitive process that respect our subjectivity. For Nakoshi, one possible path is to take responsibility for his emotional relationships, acknowledge that his white jaw is a facade, understand the meaning of his suffering, and consult a psychologist, since the psychologist's role is not only to give advice, but a guide or mirror in the process of self-confrontation. Anyway, thank you everyone who stuck with me on this crazy journey. This is only the tip of the iceberg. I strongly recommend reading the manga. The author Hidemamoto works very well with the tales of facial expression. That's all folks, may God bless everyone.